immigrant-owned businesses, and workers of color bore the brunt of the economic devastation. We stood together to say loud and clear as we rolled out this most important vaccine of our lifetime that we could not afford to repeat the same mistakes. We called on the city to release vaccine demographic data ASAP and gave specific recommendations as part of our Fair Shot NYC plan to break down public health barriers facing communities of color. Today, the city finally released that data that paints a picture of profound racial inequity. Just 11% of New Yorkers vaccinated are Black. Just 15% are Asian. Just 15% are Latino. 48% are white. It should come as no surprise that the same structural racism that has resulted in people of color bearing the disproportionate burden of COVID cases, hospitalizations, and deaths is now plaguing our vaccination program. Now, we knew this vaccine was coming. We knew where the disparities were likely to be. And yet the data shows the city did not do enough, not nearly enough, to tackle those disparities head on. This is a moral and management failure of the highest order. Fixing it requires intentional planning and rigorous focus. And we believe that we can start by requiring that vaccines provided in New York City go to the people who live in New York City. More than a quarter of people vaccinated in NYC don't live here, and nearly 60% of those people happen to be white. We need to double down on outreach, education, and culturally competent messaging to communities left behind. We will never close these gaps unless we build trust, and that will only come through repeated and authentic engagement in all of our communities of color. We need to make sure that getting vaccinated doesn't also mean losing a day's pay. Here are some of our recommendations. Essential workers of color don't have the luxury to take time off from work to get vaccinated or to manage the side effects. We must need to subsidize them to get the kind of time off needed to get to the vaccination sites. And we got to make these appointments easier. There's still too much confusion on how and to where to make an appointment. I get too many calls from the sons and daughters of older parents who can't navigate all of these broken websites that seem to be more confusing than helpful. And that has to change. We also have to be more creative and diligent. It would not take a lot of effort to reserve end-of-day slots for walk-ins, especially in communities of color, and we must continue to simplify the process of just making a basic appointment. These sites are asking for too much information. They're causing confusion and deterring people. Given that shots are covered by the federal government, let's remove this field from appointment sites to eliminate confusion. We need to increase vaccine capacity and appointments, and that means more providers and more vaccines physically available in the communities that need them the most. We need to make sure that translation services, interpreters are always available for the New Yorkers who need them. And we need to track what communities are getting the most distribution of doses and the ones that are not. We must manage this supply chain, and we must use research and data to make important decisions on how to close the gaps. This requires consistent, intentional, thoughtful, and authentic engagement, and we need programs focusing on those that are being left behind. I'm ashamed of this data today. It's a national embarrassment, but it should be the kick the city needs to address the issue. Enough with leaving our communities of color behind. We must make sure that we vaccinate our frontline workers, the people who kept our city running during the darkest days of the pandemic. And we need to turn the tide on the systemic inequality plaguing every level of our public health response. Look, I understand full well that this virus was a surprise and that testing was slowly ramped up. And a lot of the beginning of this was really difficult. But we knew this vaccine was coming almost since the onset of the virus. We had many, many months to plan. We had many opportunities to put resources in the communities we know were going to be slow to get this vaccination. And the fact that we're here today, just a few weeks after we said, let's make things better, and nothing is moving, we have to be vigilant, community, to make sure that all people have access to the vaccination. And that's why I'm happy to be here with Jumaane Williams, our public advocate, who has also been a thought leader on this issue, along with many other issues. So let me now kick it to Jumaane and Good to be with you again. I wish we were here under different circumstances.
Me as well. Thank you, Comptroller. It was good to be with you on a particularly cold day in Harlem when we asked for these numbers. I believe we both knew then what most New Yorkers were feeling. The way these numbers would pan out is exactly how they pan out. Our leaders on every level have really failed the communities, generally speaking, but the communities of more color and the most vulnerable communities, especially throughout the pandemic. First, in minimizing the infection, now maximizing the injection without the appropriate resources. And I am and continue to try to do my best to work with government partners so that our constituents can have trust in the government. That's important here. There has to be trust for this to work. But they make it difficult with every single failure. And then on top of the failure, refusing to admit that they are the reason that this has happened. Refusing to admit that there was an error and here's how we're going to make the error better. We all agree that the federal government messed up from the beginning. Even with this vaccine, we need more. We have to have more vaccines. The federal government is not responsible for the almost criminal response in these communities. They're not responsible for the numbers that the city just put out. And we're still waiting for the governor to put out the state numbers, which I assure you are going to be just as abysmal. They're not responsible for the executives like the mayor and the governor for the wrong decisions that they've made time and time again. The city's website and infrastructure is being overlaid on 20-year-old technology. 20-year-old technology. That's well before the pandemic. And the people who needed to be in the room to put the best website out there weren't in the room. We are also tired of seeing the mixed messages. Mayor, governor, get it together, get on the same page. It is sad that a group of volunteers has the best website out there to get vaccines. Now, neither the city websites or the state websites, they're all trash. And they're not working for the people who need them the most. I am glad that we are almost 90% vaccination in the state. It took a while to get there, I'm glad. But when you look at these numbers, less than half or almost 40% of the Black and brown population, they're being vaccinated, about 40% of their population. So our white residents are being vaccinated at about 1.5 times their population. That is disgusting. I think it's criminal, and it lies on the feet of this mayor for the job they're doing in the city and for the governor and the job they're doing in the state. We just have to be clear about that. To see so many people coming from outside, I can't fault people for trying to get the vaccination. I can fault our systems for allowing it to happen. Even the people from outside, there's disparity on who's coming in and getting it. But I continue to be so angry here. There needs to be no more excuses, no more finger pointing, no more task force, no more plans. We know what to do. Let's get it done. We have put forth before that we had an infrastructure that did amazingly better than we thought in the pandemic. The census infrastructure. Their primary job was to go to communities that government can't normally reach and that government doesn't trust to get them counted. That infrastructure is there. It was a city infrastructure, funded with some state funds. We have recommended time and time again to use that infrastructure. Some of this is based on our inability to coordinate properly on the government level, but some of it is our inability to put an infrastructure that can reach people who have a legitimate distrust of medicine, especially government-controlled medicine. That infrastructure is there. They've done a good job. It's not rocket science. It's not brain surgery. But the people in charge don't have the right people in the room. And they very rarely come to speak with us before the fire is there. And then we have to be talking about this while the fire is raging. I'm pleading with both of these men to put aside whatever problem they have. You can't be putting out two different informations, two different data sets, two different websites, two different plans. It makes no sense. And the mayor has to grab control of the city infrastructure to get to the people who have the distrust. So we have two problems. We have three problems. One is we need more vaccines. Got it. But what we do with the vaccines is our decision. We have to get an infrastructure that works, that people can understand, and so they don't have to count on volunteers to do it for the government. And two, we have to get people in those communities providing the information, and we have to do it quickly. I don't want to hear about a task force again. I don't want to hear about another, we're starting to think about plan. We had almost a year to think about this. We definitely had 6 to 8 months to think about this. There was no problem that's being pointed out today that we didn't know about 8 months ago. This is a complete and abject failure, once again, for the communities that are being hit the hardest, have been hit the hardest, and will be hit the hardest again. Thank you.
Thank you, Public Advocate. Hazel, if we have any questions?
Yes, if members of the press can please raise their hand and we'll call on them. Our first question comes from Sydney at Gothamist.
Hi there. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Great. Yes, this is Sydney with Gothamist and WNYC. I'm guessing, so I guess my main question here is like, could you respond to some of the new efforts the mayor announced today and how you feel like it differs from what the city is doing, and also elaborate on some of the points you all made around what the city should do, like to immediately address this problem that of equity.
Monty, you want to start?
I'm always glad to hear about plans. I'm glad that we've had and began opening vaccination sites in the hardest hit communities. We should have done that first. What I didn't hear was how the website is going to be made much better, how we're working maybe with the volunteers who did the government's job so we can incorporate what we're doing. I like the fact that they're trying to do some educational outreach. It's great. But again, I believe there is a network that we just had, the Census Network, had to reach the same exact communities that we're trying to reach now. And I think they did a relatively good job during a pandemic. Where is that network? Let's fund that network again. Let's charge them with getting information to these communities, because these communities have a right to be concerned based on the history of government and medicine that the government is involved with. Now, I will say that across the country, we do see these problems, but this is progressive New York, or it's supposed to be. So we should be leading the way on how to do this. We shouldn't be excusing our behavior because of what the country is doing. We have the ability to make our own decisions to lead the way for this country in equity and efficiency. And it's very frustrating to not see that happen and to have so much time to work on this. Whatever was mentioned today, why wasn't it put in place 6 months ago?
And I would just add that how is it possible that these 3 websites are still dysfunctional? How is it possible that after listening to experts and people on the ground trying to get their parents a vaccination, that there has been no improvement to this website? How is it possible that we have not looked and talked to the business community about building out time for people to go and get that vaccination, people who are frontline workers who don't have the ability to work from home or take off when they want to? This is all 101 best practice. And time again, we are hearing from people that this is not the urgency of now that we need. So we are calling on the mayor from the city perspective to immediately implement a program using the data that he has finally disclosed to come up with a robust plan for everybody, to also to make sure that the communities hardest hit are taking or are having the opportunity to get on websites, to take time off, and to have their questions answered. Look, I can just speak just for 1 second as controller. And a lot of people ask me almost every day, what's the future of the economy? And the future of the economy, first and foremost, leads through the vaccination program. The longer it takes to vaccinate, inoculate the city, then the harder it will be for people in small businesses, people who are struggling economically. There's no shortcut. And you cannot have this laid back attitude. And that's why we're here again. We came together, I think it was 2 weeks ago, right? And the reason we're doing this again is because they got to get it right. And if they don't get it right, we'll be here next week as well.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Steve Burns.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, good to be with you both. A couple of questions. First, I know Mr. Stringer, you just mentioned that you'd like to see New York move to a rule of only vaccinating New York City residents. Obviously, that might pose a challenge given that some city employees live outside the 5 boroughs. So I wanted to see how that kind of overlays itself. And secondly, the governor was asked about this. He presented this more, not specifically about residents, but overall. He presented this more as a psychological problem than a logistical problem, that there's more hesitancy among communities of color. But he said that they are doing enough outreach, that they have set up enough in the hardest hit areas where the logistics aren't a problem. So I wanted to see if you could respond to both of those.
Look, I would say that I know, look, obviously there are efforts being made. And I do think when you start to drill down on the data, you really see that the disparity in terms of race, I think in part comes because we're not focused on city residents. And I do think there's an exemption to be made, obviously, for the frontline workers in hospitals, but that is also coming up with a coherent program. I'm just looking at the data today that shows a tremendous increase in the number of white people having access to the vaccine and the low numbers of people in the African-American community. And I do agree with the governor. Part of this is people's hesitancy and perhaps not wanting to take the vaccine. But there's so much more we can do when people want to take the vaccine, like clean up the websites, like be more out in public and create a real program, as Jumaane mentioned. There's so much more to do. But right now, with the data that was finally released, we can see there's real disparity. So we cannot simply do a little, we have to double down, and that's what we're trying to do here today.
I would say if the governor is saying that he's done enough, it would explain the entire past year and how we got here. Of continually saying we're doing enough and blaming other folks might be a good synopsis of how we got to where we are now. My hope is that he will reconsider that, because it's clearly not true. People are going to try to get the vaccine. I cannot say, to people and their family members what they're trying to do to protect their families. What I can say is people should, use a consideration of who needs to get the vaccines immediately and who does have the capacity to wait. At the same time, we do have our first responsibility to people who are in New York City. The state has first responsibility to people who live in New York State. If that was working better, I think you'd see better coordination and people have the access to the vaccine where they live. I wish the only problem was the fact that I guess almost a third of the people are coming in from New York City. One, if there was better planning around the state, they wouldn't have to do that. But two, on top of that, even the people who are coming in are primarily white New Yorkers. And even within New York City, the people who are getting the vaccinations are primarily white New Yorkers at a rate of 1.5 times their population. Black and brown are almost 40% of their population. That is ridiculous. We are not doing enough. The concerns that the governor has raised is true. There is hesitancy in these communities. But we knew that. What did you do about it? We knew that during the pandemic. We knew that before the pandemic. We knew that for the census count. And there was a robust plan full with resources to get past that. We didn't do that. It is not enough to just open a vaccination site in these communities, which came late. You also have to have a robust education with cultural competent people. The census is a great opportunity to look at how we can get that done successfully. And we have to do it empathetically, understanding that these communities have a very sordid history with government knocking on their door. It's generally not a good thing when that happens. And there's a very big history about these communities and government telling them, just come and do this medical procedure, it's all good. And so you have to do that empathetically. but you have to have a plan for it. We have not had a robust plan to do that. And that is the failure of government. When we try to figure out where government needs to step in, this is it. The hardest hit communities should have the hardest hit responses, and that has not happened today.
And can I just say, 3 questions have to be asked of the mayor tomorrow or today. What are you doing with the thousands of contact tracers? What's the plan? What are you doing to fix the websites? And what are we doing to drill down on the data, given the disparity in who's getting the inoculations? What is the outreach plan, as Jumaane mentioned? Plain and simple, that's what we have to start focusing on.
And I agree with that. And the one good thing about this data is we wanted it so that we can adapt and move quickly in real time. We have the data now. The mayor is in control of the city. He has the ability to answer the questions that Scott just mentioned and put a plan in place. The mayor has that ability to do it, and he should do it. And he should do it quickly. Like, again, some of this, like it just, I get flustered at how upsetting this is, that we keep coming to this same point over and over again. When a lot of this is not rocket science, and a lot of this, if the mayor had the right folks in the room, if he was listening to some of us who were speaking, who were putting out ideas early on, we'd be such further. We'd be so much further. I mean, this website, this data, that's a problem. These problems predate pandemic, where there was failure from this administration, from the mayoral administration on so many levels.
Anybody else?
Our next question comes from Amanda Eisenberg.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yep.
good afternoon.
Great. Thank you both so much for your time. So I wanted to ask for a little bit more specifics on the plans that you're calling for. So the mayor put out a press release that I'm looking at right now that he wants to expand certain access to people for vaccines in 33 neighborhoods. So it's an expansion from the original 27 neighborhoods. And so I wanted to know, obviously you're saying that this hasn't gone far enough. So my first question is, how do you think targeting these communities will help? Can you speak a little bit more to that? And then my follow-up question is, how do you plan on holding the mayor accountable? I know you've been having these press conferences, but what more can you do?
Well, I'll start a couple of things. First of all, there are 3 citywide elected officials. 2 of them have come together to push what we think are reasonable suggestions to go into communities. First, a couple of weeks ago, we stood in Harlem and we said we needed data, and we pushed very hard because we knew once the data was released, we would have a roadmap to how we get to underserved communities. So we have the data, late as it was. And now when we take a quick look at the data, we realize that we have to drill down specifically. And look, I'm glad the mayor put out a press release. I've seen many of those press releases, but here's what I'm hearing from my constituents. People are struggling with getting appointments. People are blown away by these different websites. And I'm not talking about seniors who are 70 and 80. I'm talking about the sons and daughters of their parents who are frightened that they are the ones that have the obligation to make the appointments, and they can't figure out how to do it. Why we are not addressing this website debacle, I don't understand, and we're going to continue to push on that. Second, if you want to drill down in communities, you have to actually show us a plan. Who are the community stakeholders you're talking to? Who are the people that are respected in neighborhoods that you're reaching out to? We know how to do this because this is what we do, but this is more about roundtabling, getting out the word, bringing people who are trusted in neighborhoods to be part of this effort. We have thousands of contact tracers. What is happening to the contact tracers that aren't doing the contact tracing? How can we direct to get to communities? And again, we have to make sure that the way we deal with communities who are suspicious of government is you bring the messengers that are respected into communities. So I would like to see a more drilled down plan, not press release responses, because again, 1, this is life and death. 2, this has real implications for our economy. And 3, the reason we come together, and we don't do this every day, the 2 of us are here because we're both coming from the same place. We're talking to people who have real concerns about the future of the vaccination program.
You know, I think it was last week, both Scott and I were on a press conference with the mayor about having divested from the pension fossil fuels. I said then it was great because I believe that the city needs to see their elected leaders together. That doesn't happen very often. I don't know if it's happened at all since this pandemic started. That is in itself a problem. We should be all together figuring out the answers to these questions. The mayor has not created that space for the leaders to be talking in one voice. He should do that immediately. So one, I think is helpful. And two, we have ideas that we've been presenting for quite some time. The press, the same thing as the comptroller, the press releases are great. I've seen them before. I've seen them all throughout the pandemic, and yet we are still here. Everything that he's put forth in the pandemic now was known 6 months ago. We knew the concerns that were happening in these communities. We knew the concerns, we knew what communities were hit the hardest. We knew the concerns they were going to have. Why does it take until February to get this out? The contract traces, I think almost everyone would agree, hasn't done a good job anyway. Why not change them now to be the ones that are also providing information about the vaccination, since they're supposed to have this great network? Again, with the network that we had just a few months ago with the census. It boggles my mind why it takes so long to do what everybody knows needs to get done. And so many things that people have been recommending, not for a few weeks, for months and months. This is city-specific data. This is things that the mayor can do. The comptroller said, the website, it's absurd. There's no excuse for that. And the people who need to be involved in the website production, that their job is to do this. We're not in the room when this website was created.
Anybody else, Hazel?
Any other questions from the press? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you
Thank you.
everyone for your time.
Public Advocate, good to be with you. Thank you, everybody.
This is everyone.